What do you do when you're judged just by how you look? Chelsea Road found herself in the middle of a tense encounter after a routine stop turned into a battle of assumptions. In a world where prejudice can shatter reputations in an instant, can the truth fight back? Chelsea wasn't expecting a confrontation when she entered the store, but one officer's assumptions would soon unravel. And the stakes were higher than anyone imagined. Curious to know how this intense moment plays out? Don't miss a second. Subscribe now for more stories that challenge the status quo. The store was nearly empty, with just a cashier behind the counter, a man browsing the snacks, and a police officer leaning against the soda machine near the entrance. Morgan barely glanced at him as she walked past. "Hey, hold up," the voice was sharp and commanding. Morgan recognized the tone well. She had used it herself, just not in this context. She turned, her gaze steady, as the officer stepped closer. He was tall and bulky, the type who likely worked out just to fill out his uniform. His badge read M. Miller. "You lost?" he asked, scanning her up and down. Morgan let out a slow breath. She knew exactly where this was going. "No," she replied, keeping her tone even. "Just grabbing something real quick." Miller folded his arms, smirking as though he had her figured out. "You sure about that?" The cashier, an older man with graying hair, shifted uncomfortably behind the counter. The guy in the snack aisle suddenly became very interested in a bag of chips. Morgan had seen this before, how someone's presence was questioned simply because of how they looked. She met Miller's gaze without flinching. "Is there a problem, officer?" Miller scoffed, shaking his head. "Yeah, there is. I've seen this before. Someone walks in, pretends to shop, waits for the right moment. Then bam, register's empty, and they're out the door." Morgan felt a cold knot in her stomach but kept her expression unreadable. "Is that what you think I'm doing?" she asked. Miller stepped closer. "You tell me." Morgan glanced at the cashier. "You want to tell him, or should I?" The old man swallowed hard, looking nervous, like he wanted to intervene but didn't know how. His fingers lightly tapped the counter. Miller chuckled, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. Morgan exhaled slowly, shaking her head. She knew what was coming next. Miller pulled out his radio, pressing the button with unnecessary force. "Yeah, I need to check on a possible suspect at the door." But then the door chimed, and another officer stepped in. This time, the new arrival didn't look amused. The officer, a woman with a short, no-nonsense haircut and sharp eyes, nodded to Adams Morgan. "You know who that is?" she asked. Miller glanced at Morgan again, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Yeah, she's SWAT Commander Morgan RHS," the woman cut in, stepping closer. "You just detained your highest-ranking superior over a protein bar." The silence was suffocating. Miller's mouth opened but closed again, his face drained of color. The man in the snack aisle was recording with his phone. The cashier exhaled like he'd been holding his breath the entire time. Morgan just stood there, arms crossed, waiting. This moment was his. How he handled it would determine everything that came next. The silence dragged on, heavy with tension. Miller struggled to process what had just happened. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Then his jaw tightened as if trying to justify himself. He stammered, glancing from Morgan to the other officer and back again. Morgan didn't move. She wasn't going to make it easy for him. If he was looking for a way out, he was going to have to dig himself out of this hole alone. Sergeant Julia Adams crossed her arms and stepped closer. "I asked you a question, Miller. Do you know who you just tried to detain?" Miller's fingers twitched at his belt. The smug confidence he had moments ago drained completely. He now looked like a rookie caught making the biggest mistake of his career. Miller finally muttered, "I didn't know." His voice was weaker now. Julia scoffed. "Didn't know? Didn't bother to ask? You mean you saw a black woman in a hoodie and assumed she was here to rob the place?" The man in the snack aisle was still recording, and the cashier stood frozen, gripping the counter as if bracing for something. Miller's eyes darted to Morgan again, desperation creeping into his expression. "Look, I was just doing my job," he argued weakly. Morgan cut him off, her voice calm but sharp. "Profiling people based on how they look." Miller straightened his shoulders, trying to salvage what little authority he had left. "I had reasonable suspicion," he argued, but his words lacked strength. Morgan exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "No, you didn't." The words landed like a gut punch. Julia stepped closer to Morgan, her tone firm. You need to call it for what it is, Miller. You saw a black woman in casual clothes, assumed she didn't belong, and decided to throw your weight away. Miller clenched his jaw but didn't argue. He knew there was no coming back from this. Morgan finally moved, reaching into her pocket. The tension in the room spiked again, and Miller instinctively took half a step back, his hand twitching to Adams's belt. Julia narrowed her eyes, and Morgan let out a quiet, bitter laugh. Relax, she said, pulling out her badge and flipping it open. She held it up at chest level, letting the gold emblem catch the fluorescent light. Maybe if you'd asked for this instead of assuming the worst, you wouldn't be in this position right now. Miller swallowed hard. His face was red, but whether from embarrassment or frustration, Morgan didn't care. The cashier finally exhaled, running a hand over his face. Damn, he muttered under his breath. Julia turned to him. Sir, do you have security cameras in this store? The older man nodded quickly. Yeah, the footage records everything. If you need to see it, we will. Julia nodded firmly. Morgan tucked her badge away and took a slow step to Adams. Miller. So let me get this straight, you were ready to call in a suspect over absolutely nothing. No cause, no real reason, just your own bias. Miller's breathing was uneven now. He looked like he wanted to argue, but he had no ground left to stand on. Julia gestured to Adams, the door. You need to step outside now. Miller hesitated, then turned stiffly and walked out. His steps were heavy against the tile. As soon as the door swung shut behind him, Morgan shook her head. This happens more than people realize, she said, her voice softer now. I've been in law enforcement for a long time, but every time it still feels the same. Julia rubbed the bridge of her nose. I'm sorry. You shouldn't have to deal with this. Morgan shrugged. You'd think I'd be used to it by now. The man in the snack aisle finally spoke. That was insane. I mean, I've seen stuff like this on the news, but he gestured to Adams, the door. He was ready to throw you in cuffs just because you were existing. Morgan gave him a small, tired smirk. That's usually how it goes. The cashier cleared his throat, stepping out from behind the counter. Listen, I should have said something sooner. I saw the way he was talking to you. He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. Morgan met his gaze and he exhaled. But I was scared. I see what happens to people who step in. I didn't want to make things worse. Julia nodded slowly. I get it. But silence lets this keep happening. The old man sighed. Yeah, he said, looking at Morgan. You handled that like a pro. Morgan smiled faintly. Well, that's because I am one. The tension had finally started to fade, but Morgan knew this moment wouldn't leave her mind anytime soon. It never did. Julia checked her watch. I need to make a report on this. You want to add anything? Morgan glanced at the door. Yeah, make sure it doesn't get buried. Julia nodded, understanding. I won't let it. Morgan gave her a grateful look before grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge section and heading to Adams, the counter. Still going to make a purchase? The cashier asked, a bit surprised. Morgan smirked. Yeah, I didn't come here for drama. Julia laughed. The guy in the snack aisle chuckled, shaking his head. As Morgan stepped outside, she found Miller standing near his patrol car. His face turned away. He didn't look at her as she walked past, but he didn't have to. She'd already made her point. Morgan stepped out of the convenience store, the cold night air biting against her skin. She twisted open the cap of her water bottle. The door swung shut behind her with a faint chime, and the sounds of the city rushed back in. Car horns, distant chatter, the low hum of traffic lights flickering between signals. Miller stood stiff-lie by his patrol car, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on a crack in the pavement. Morgan walked past Miller without acknowledging him. She was heading to Adams the street when another patrol car rolled up. A tall, Bishaw-shouldered black man stepped out, Captain Daniel Graves. Morgan had worked with him before, respected him for his efficiency, and knew why he was here. Julia had escalated the situation. Graves' sharp eyes flickered between Morgan and Miller, then focused on Julia. Tell me what happened, he said. Julia didn't hesitate. She explained how Miller had detained Morgan without cause, made assumptions, and tried to falsify a report before she intervened. Graves turned to Morgan, confirming the story. She nodded, and Miller spoke, but Graves silenced him. Graves stepped closer to Miller, his voice steady. You know who this is? He paused. She's one of the highest-ranking tactical officers, runs the entire SWAT team, and has led the most dangerous operations in the city. If she wanted to, she could have had you on the ground before you even reached for your radio. The only reason you're still standing is because she showed more restraint than you ever have." Miller remained silent, his face red. Graves continued asking, "Was it worth it? Was your ego worth embarrassing yourself in this department?" Miller opened his mouth but had nothing to say. Graves finally told him, "Turn in your badge and gun." Miller, stiff and jerky, handed over his badge and weapon with shaking hands. Graves accepted them without a word. Morgan crossed her arms and remarked, "A simple 'Can I see your ID, ma'am?' would have saved you a lot of trouble." Miller didn't respond, instead walking to Adams's patrol car and slamming the door shut. Julia, with a satisfied whistle, watched as Miller left. Graves turned back to Morgan, asking if she was okay. Morgan nodded. "I've had worse." Graves shook his head, saying, "You shouldn't have to say that." Julia checked her phone, confirming that the store's security footage was being processed. Graves sighed. "It won't undo what happened, but it'll ensure the right people see it." He turned back to Morgan and asked if she wanted to make an official statement. After thinking for a moment, Morgan shook her head. "My presence alone made the point." Graves nodded, understanding. He asked if she wanted a ride back, but Morgan declined, smirking, "I'm fine, Cap." Graves clapped her on the shoulder before walking back to his vehicle. Julia lingered, glancing at Miller, sitting in his patrol car with an unreadable expression. "Think he'll actually learn from this?" Julia asked. Morgan took a sip of her water and didn't answer. Morgan and Julia stood in comfortable silence before Julia apologized for what had happened. Morgan shrugged it off, saying it happens every day to people with less power and fewer ways to fight back. Julia nodded, agreeing, but added that they needed more leaders like Morgan. Morgan smirked, asking if Julia wanted her to take Graves' job. Julia laughed, saying she'd pay to see that. Morgan checked her phone, saw a message, and said she had to go. Julia nodded. "Always got your back." Morgan headed to her car, the weight of the night settling in. She wasn't shaken, just tired. Tired of proving herself, of being tested but always passing. Her phone buzzed again. It was from Captain Graves, reminding her about the SWAT briefing. She let out a tired laugh, but duty called, and she had to focus. She wasn't going to let one racist cop ruin her career. At the precinct, her team stood at attention as she approached. They all saluted her in unison, a gesture that stopped her in her tracks. It wasn't what she expected, but it meant something. These were the men and women she had led through dangerous situations, and they respected her. Graves stepped for Adams, smirking. "Figured we'd remind you who you are." Morgan smiled, her heart full, as she stepped for Adams to lead her team once more. Morgan smiled faintly as Graves spoke. "I didn't forget." Julia, standing off to the side, nodded. "The whole department knows what happened tonight. Word travels fast, and we wanted you to know your real team stands with you." Morgan exhaled, looking around at the officers who mattered, the ones who knew her for who she was, not just her uniform. "You're making a big deal out of this," she joked. "Damn right," Martinez replied. "We're not letting some rookie disrespect our commander," Diaz added. Morgan felt their support, the weight of it sinking in. Graves clapped his hands. "All right, briefing in 5, let's move." As they started to disperse, Graves leaned in and asked quietly, "You good?" Morgan met his gaze. "You, I'm good." He nodded and walked ahead. Morgan followed, head high and step steady. She knew this wasn't the end. There would be more battles ahead, more people like Miller. But tonight she was reminded she wasn't alone in this fight. She never would be. Morgan walked into the briefing room, the door closing behind her with a soft click. Her team was already assembled, quiet and focused. The familiar hum of the fluorescent lights above, the subtle rustling of papers, and the low murmur of conversations faded as she stepped in. They were ready for action, whatever the night held. She gave them a nod, a small smile tugging at her lips. "All right, let's get to work." She took her place at the front of the room, standing tall, feeling the weight of the responsibility she carried, but also the strength of the support surrounding her. Graves was already at the whiteboard, briefing them on the details of the mission. Morgan's mind was sharp, her body moving on autopilot as she absorbed the information. But even as they moved for Adams, her thoughts kept drifting back to the confrontation earlier. She'd faced prejudice and bias countless times before, but there was something different about today. It wasn't just about standing her ground. It was about being seen, truly seen for who she was. not just as a woman in law enforcement, but as a person who deserved respect. The room settled into silence as she took a deep breath and refocused on the task at hand. "We're not just taking down criminals tonight, we're proving a point," she said, her voice steady. "That we will fight for justice, for each other, and for what's right, no matter who stands in our way." Her team's eyes were fixed on her now, the respect clear in their expressions. They knew what she stood for, and they were ready to follow her into any battle. "Let's move," she said, the command firm and unwavering. And with that, they were off. The mission awaited, and Morgan was ready. She knew she could never change the world in a day, but with every step she took, with every decision she made, she was getting closer to the future she wanted to see. One where respect wasn't earned through force, but through integrity. And tonight she was one step closer to making that a reality. As they left the briefing room, Morgan felt a surge of purpose. The weight of the earlier incident was still there, lingering in the back of her mind, but it didn't hold her back. It propelled her for Adams. She could feel the eyes of her team on her, the unwavering trust they had in her leadership. That trust was sacred to her. It wasn't just about commanding, it was about earning that respect every single day. The night air was cooler as they made their way to the vehicles, and the familiar hum of police radios filled the air. Morgan moved with purpose, her strides confident. As she climbed into the front of the lead sieve, she glanced around at the team, strong, determined, ready. They were a unit, not just colleagues, but a family bound by a common mission. And she would protect that bond at all costs. The convoy rolled out, lights flashing, engines purring quietly in the night. As the team made their way to Adams, the mission site, Morgan's thoughts returned to the events at the store. What had happened was a reminder that there were still battles to fight, still biases to challenge, and a long shaw ahead in the fight for equality and respect. But tonight she had made a difference. Tonight she had fought for what was right and stood firm against injustice. The mission took them to a quiet neighborhood where the calm of the evening was shattered by the urgency of their presence. The adrenaline kicked in, and Morgan's mind snapped into focus. There was no room for hesitation. The plan was clear, the stakes high. They had one shot to get it right. Morgan led her team with precision, every decision calculated, every move deliberate. The operation was swift, successful, and smooth. No casualties, no setbacks. It was over before the criminals even knew what hit them. As they secured the scene and waited for backup to process everything, Morgan stood for a moment, catching her breath. She wasn't just proud of the mission's success, she was proud of her team. Proud of the progress they had made as a unit, as a family. They had proven that integrity and respect were the foundation of everything they did. And that was worth more than any victory. As they packed up and headed back to base, Morgan knew that every fight, every challenge, every obstacle was part of the journey to Adams' real change. No matter how difficult the shaw ahead would be, she would keep walking it. And she would do it with the strength, the courage, and the support of the team that had her back every step of the way. Note: this story is entirely fictional and created for the purpose of raising awareness. It highlights issues of responsibility, justice, and the importance of treating everyone with respect and dignity. We firmly oppose violence, prejudice, and injustice in all forms. Viewer discretion is advised.